The bright sun hung high in the sky, and the streets of the city buzzed with the usual noise of people going about their business. Cars honked, vendors shouted to advertise their goods, and children ran, laughing, on the sidewalks. But amidst all the hustle and bustle, something strange was unfolding. A young black boy, homeless and alone, stood near the corner of a busy street. His clothes were tattered, his face dirty from the days of wandering through the streets with no place to call home. He was only 10 years old but had already seen more of the harsh world than most people would in their whole lifetime. His name was Kwame. Kwame had spent the last few days trying to find food and a safe place to sleep. He had become used to the loneliness, the hunger, and the endless cycle of looking for a meal. Despite everything, there was always a flicker of hope in his eyes, a small belief that something better might come along. Little did he know, today would be the day that would change everything. Across the street, a sleek black car zoomed by. It was the kind of car that only the very rich could afford, a Maybach. It was polished to perfection, and inside sat a man with an air of power and confidence. His name was Mr. Montgomery. Mr. Montgomery was a millionaire, one of the wealthiest men in the city. He owned multiple businesses, luxury homes, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. But despite all his success, there was something missing in his life. He was lonely. He was restless. He had everything, but none of it brought him true happiness. As he sat in the back of the Maybach, staring out the window, he noticed something strange on the road ahead. A snake, slithering quickly across the pavement. Before he could react, it darted right towards the car. A sharp, sudden pain shot through his leg, and within seconds, he felt the sting of poison entering his veins. His vision blurred, and panic set in. The snake's venom was powerful, and he could feel himself growing weaker by the second. "Stop the car!" Mr. Montgomery shouted, his voice shaky. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. He was already feeling the effects of the poison, and he knew he didn't have much time left. The driver panicked as he saw his boss slumped against the window, struggling to stay conscious. He looked around, desperate for help. That's when he spotted the boy. Kwame was standing just a few feet away, his eyes wide with curiosity. He had seen the whole thing, the snake, the car, and the millionaire falling victim to the venom. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then something inside him clicked. Without thinking, Kwame ran toward the car, his small feet pounding the pavement. He reached the door and tugged it open, just as Mr. Montgomery's eyes fluttered closed. Kwame didn't know exactly what he was doing, but something inside him told him that this man needed help. He grabbed the millionaire's wrist, his pulse weak and fast, and pulled him out of the car with all the strength he could muster. "Help! Somebody help!" Kwame screamed, but no one seemed to notice. People walked by, oblivious to the drama unfolding right before them. Kwame wasn't giving up, though. He dragged Mr. Montgomery to the curb, his tiny hands trembling from both fear and the weight of the situation. The man was barely breathing now, and the venom had spread quickly. Time was running out. Just when Kwame thought it might be too late, something extraordinary happened. The Maybach, Mr. Montgomery's car, began to move again. A sleek, shiny figure appeared behind the car, a man in a suit stepping out from behind it. It wasn't just any man. It was someone who had been watching everything from the shadows. His suit was as flawless as the car, and he had the same air of wealth and influence as Mr. Montgomery. Without saying a word, the suited man walked toward Kwame, looking down at the young boy and the millionaire in his arms. There was no question in his eyes. He was here for one purpose, and one purpose only. "Get in," the man said coolly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You've saved his life." Kwame hesitated, not understanding. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky from the adrenaline of the moment. "Who are you?" The suited man didn't respond to the question. He simply gestured to the car, as if his presence was enough to speak for him. "I'll explain later," he added. And that's when it happened. The Maybach, gleaming with luxury, suddenly came to life. The car moved forward with a quiet hum, as if powered by something unseen. Kwame could barely process what was happening. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. But before he could even begin to understand the magnitude of the moment, he noticed something strange. Just 10 minutes later, the car had stopped. He looked out the window, his heart pounding, and what he saw next made his blood run cold. A massive crowd had gathered around the car, all staring at him. 100 different faces, all full of questions. And behind them, the image of a large mansion loomed, one he had never seen before. "Get out," the man said softly, his voice filled with a sense of finality. Kwame stepped out of the car, unsure of what was happening. His heart raced. Was this a dream? Was he really about to meet the millionaire he had saved? But the moment his foot hit the ground, everything went black. And that's where the story would leave him, for now. What happens next? What does the future hold for Kwame, the homeless boy who helped the millionaire? Only time would tell, and the truth was far more complicated than anyone could ever imagine. When Kwame opened his eyes again, everything felt different. The world around him seemed larger, brighter, and filled with strange, unfamiliar smells. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of what had happened. The events from moments before were still a blur. Being in the back of the Maybach, the mysterious man, and the mansion that had appeared out of nowhere. He sat up quickly, his head spinning slightly. He was no longer on the city street, surrounded by strangers and the chaos of everyday life. Instead, he found himself in a large, comfortable room, lying on a soft bed with thick, plush blankets. The walls were adorned with beautiful paintings, and golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, warm light across the room. The place felt like a palace, far different from the cold streets he had come from. Kwame rubbed his eyes and looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. Was he dreaming? Was this all some kind of fantasy? He could feel his heart pounding, his mind racing as questions filled his head. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could say anything, the door slowly creaked open. It was the man in the suit, the one who had been in the Maybach. "Ah, you're awake," the man said, stepping inside. His expression was calm and unreadable. "Good. We need to talk." Kwame opened his mouth to speak, but found himself unable to form any words. He had so many questions, but the one thing that stood out more than anything was the feeling of disbelief. How had he gone from being a homeless boy in the streets to being inside this mansion, with a millionaire's life hanging in the balance? The man continued, his voice smooth and measured. "I'm not sure what you know, but you saved a man's life today. That man, Mr. Montgomery, is very important to a lot of people. And now, you're in a situation where your actions have placed you at the center of something much bigger than you can imagine." Kwame's mouth went dry. He wanted to ask what he meant, but he didn't know how to start. The confusion and fear that had been building inside him bubbled to the surface, but he couldn't quite get the words out. The man sat down on a chair across from Kwame. "You must be wondering what's happening, why you're here. Let me explain." Kwame nodded, finally finding his voice. I don't understand. Who are you? And what does Mr. Montgomery have to do with me?" The man smiled faintly, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I'm someone who's been watching Mr. Montgomery for a while now. I've been tracking his movements, his investments, and the people he interacts with. He's a powerful man, and there are a lot of people who are interested in his business, both good and bad. But today, you changed everything. You saved his life when nobody else would have been able to." Kwame's head was spinning. He couldn't keep up. I didn't do anything. I just saw him hurt, and I tried to help." The man's eyes softened, just slightly. "You may not think you did much, but what you did was extraordinary. You didn't hesitate when you saw someone in need. You didn't run away or ignore him like most would have. That courage has put you in a position you can't easily walk away from." Kwame felt a lump in his throat. He had no idea what this man was talking about, but one thing was clear. His life had just taken a dramatic turn, and he wasn't sure whether it was for better or worse. The man stood up and walked toward the window, glancing out at the sprawling gardens below. "What you don't know is that people like Mr. Montgomery aren't easily saved. The people who wanted him gone will stop at nothing to make sure he's eliminated. They'll come for him again, and they'll come for anyone connected to him. And now that you've helped him, you'll be involved whether you like it or not." Kwame's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" What's going to happen to me? The man turned, his face unreadable. That's the thing. We don't know yet. It all depends on what you decide to do next. You can choose to walk away and never look back. You can go back to the streets and pretend nothing happened. But if you stay, if you choose to be involved in this world, Kwame felt his stomach drop. He wasn't sure if he was ready for any of this, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had already been changed forever. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What should he do? Before he could respond, the door to the room opened again. This time, it was Mr. Montgomery, the man who had been bitten by the snake. He looked different now. The color had returned to his face, and his movements were more controlled. His eyes locked onto Kwame, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something Kwame couldn't quite place. "Thank you," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice deep and sincere. "You saved my life today. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Kwame didn't know how to respond. He had never been thanked like this before. In fact, he hadn't been thanked by anyone for a long time. It felt strange, almost overwhelming. "I don't know what to say," Kwame whispered, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him even more. Mr. Montgomery looked at him, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "You don't need to say anything, but I'll be keeping an eye on you. You've proven you're more than just a street kid. You're something special." Kwame's heart raced as he tried to understand the words. What did this man mean? What was he getting himself into? And then, just as quickly as the moment arrived, it disappeared. The suited man, the one who had been watching the whole situation unfold, stepped forward. "It's time to make a decision, Kwame. This is where your life begins to take a new direction. You're not just a boy from the streets anymore. You're part of something much bigger." Kwame swallowed hard. His mind was racing. He couldn't understand the full picture, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. And as the door closed behind him, leaving him alone with the weight of his thoughts, Kwame realized one thing above all else. He was standing at the crossroads of a journey that would lead him down a dangerous, unpredictable path. What would happen next? What would he choose? Kwame couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was changing too quickly, too dramatically. One minute, he was wandering the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back, and now, he was sitting in a mansion, surrounded by people who were powerful and mysterious. His mind was in a whirl. He glanced around the room once more, trying to make sense of it all. The furniture was luxurious. Rich velvet chairs, gold-framed paintings, and polished wooden tables. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of wealth and secrecy. The suited man had left after speaking to him, and Mr. Montgomery, who was still recovering from the snake bite, had gone to rest in another room. Kwame was alone now, with nothing but the faint hum of air conditioning to break the silence. Kwame's mind raced. He thought of the streets, of the cold nights he had spent in alleyways, of the hunger that gnawed at him every day. And yet, here he was, in a mansion that seemed like a world apart from the life he had always known. He wasn't sure if he should feel lucky or terrified. The moment he stepped outside the room, a butler appeared out of nowhere. He was an older man, dressed in a sharp black suit, with a polite smile that seemed almost too practiced. "Good evening, young sir," the butler said, bowing slightly. "Mr. Montgomery has instructed me to show you to the dining room. Dinner is served." Kwame hesitated. Was he really ready to sit down and have a meal in a place like this? Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away from it all, but the hunger inside him won out. He hadn't eaten properly in days. His stomach growled, reminding him of just how much he needed this. The butler led him down a long hallway, past more doors that led to rooms he couldn't even begin to imagine. The walls were lined with impressive artwork, paintings of people he didn't recognize, landscapes he had never seen. The sheer opulence of the place made him feel small and out of place, but he followed silently. When they arrived at the dining room, Kwame's eyes widened. The table stretched long and wide, covered with fine china and silverware, and a variety of dishes that filled the air with delicious smells. Roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and vibrant vegetables were neatly arranged, as if they had been prepared by a world-class chef. "Please sit," the butler said, pulling out a chair for him. Mr. Montgomery will join you shortly. Kwame didn't need to be told twice. He sat down, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the fork. The food was beyond anything he had ever tasted before. Each bite was a mix of flavors so rich that it felt like a dream. He ate quickly, savoring every moment. While he ate, his mind couldn't stop racing. What was Mr. Montgomery really like? And why had he been chosen for this? The questions kept piling up. But for now, all he could do was focus on the meal, the first real meal he had had in a long time. Before he could finish, the door opened, and Mr. Montgomery entered. He looked much better now. His face was no longer pale, and the strength had returned to his step. He walked confidently to the table and took a seat across from Kwame. "Thank you for staying, Kwame," Mr. Montgomery said. His voice was calm but carried an edge of authority. "I know this must all be overwhelming for you. I didn't expect you to be here, but you've shown something today that I didn't think existed anymore." Kwame put his fork down, feeling the weight of Mr. Montgomery's words. I don't understand. Why me? Why did you bring me here?" Mr. Montgomery leaned forward slightly. "I know it's hard to grasp, but your actions today have set things in motion. You saved my life, and that's not something that happens by accident. You were in the right place at the right time, but more than that, you showed courage. A kind of courage that is rare." Kwame's mind was spinning. He didn't feel courageous. He had just done what anyone would do, helped someone in need. He couldn't comprehend why this had to be such a big deal. "Why do I matter to you?" Kwame asked, his voice small but firm. "I'm just a homeless kid. I don't have anything. No one cares about me." Mr. Montgomery's eyes softened slightly. "That's where you're wrong. People do care about you. You just haven't met the right ones yet. You matter because you're different. You have the kind of heart that most people in my world don't have. And that's what makes you valuable." Kwame didn't know how to respond. He had never been called valuable before. In his world, people ignored him, avoided him. He wasn't someone people noticed. But now, here he was, sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the city, being told he mattered. Just as Kwame was about to ask another question, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. The butler entered, his expression tense. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, "there is an urgent matter. It seems that someone has been trying to get in. They've managed to get past the gate guards." Mr. Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "Who is it?" "We don't know, sir, but we've been monitoring them. They're persistent." Kwame's heart skipped a beat. Something didn't feel right. The unease in the butler's voice made him nervous. Mr. Montgomery stood up abruptly, his face hardening. "Stay here," he said to Kwame. "I need to handle this." Kwame watched as Mr. Montgomery left the room, his mind racing. Who would try to break into the mansion? And why now, of all times? There was a heavy feeling in the air, like a storm was coming. Kwame felt a chill run down his spine. As he sat there, waiting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be caught in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The very moment he thought he had found a safe place, it was slipping away from him. Minutes passed. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Then, without warning, the door slammed open, and two men in dark suits entered, their faces grim. "Mr. Montgomery's orders are clear," one of them said, his voice cold. "We need to move him." Kwame stood up, alarm spreading through his chest. "What's going on? Where's Mr. Montgomery?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Kwame by the arm and pulled him toward the door. "You're coming with us. Now." Kwame struggled, but the grip was too strong. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he didn't want to go anywhere with these men. Something was very wrong. As they dragged him out of the dining room, Kwame's mind raced. What was this all about? Why were they so eager to move him? And what was Mr. Montgomery involved in that had put his life, and Kwame's, at risk? Before he could gather his thoughts, the entire mansion seemed to shake, and a loud, echoing crash came from somewhere nearby. The men around him froze. "What was that?" Kwame whispered, his heart pounding. The man who had grabbed him didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a phone and made a call, his voice low and urgent. "Sir, it's begun. We need to move him now. They're here." Kwame's stomach dropped. Whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The world around Kwame seemed to blur into chaos. The once peaceful mansion now felt like a trap, the walls closing in around him as he was dragged through the halls by the men in dark suits. The distant sounds of shouting echoed in the corridors, and the air felt thick with tension. Something had gone terribly wrong. He could feel the change, a shift in the energy of the house, like a storm had rolled in suddenly. "Move faster." One of the men barked at the other, urging him to hurry. Kwame's heart raced. He tried to pull away, but their grip on him was like iron. Every step felt heavier, and his mind kept spiraling with questions. What was going on? Why was everything falling apart so quickly? They reached the back of the mansion, where the door to the garage stood wide open. The sound of engines revving could be heard in the distance, but it wasn't the smooth hum of luxury cars Kwame had grown used to. No, this was something different, something urgent, something dangerous. As they shoved him into the back of a black SUV, Kwame caught a glimpse of the chaos outside. Several black SUVs were already lined up, their headlights cutting through the darkness, and several armed men in tactical gear were preparing for something. The mansion was surrounded. Kwame's mind was racing as he was shoved into the car. The men quickly got in after him, closing the doors with force. The driver's seat was occupied by a man who didn't look at all concerned with the situation. His eyes were cold, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped off, the tires screeching on the pavement. Kwame could barely breathe, his chest tight with fear. He tried to piece together what had happened, but everything was happening so fast that it was hard to keep up. The last thing he remembered was Mr. Montgomery, but now, the millionaire's name barely made sense in this chaotic world that Kwame had stumbled into. "Where are we going?" Kwame finally managed to ask, his voice shaking. The man next to him, who had a scar running down his cheek, glanced at him with cold eyes. "You're just a kid. Keep quiet. You don't need to know." Kwame's mind was racing even faster now. Just a few hours ago, he had been a hungry, tired boy on the streets. Now, he was in the middle of a dangerous situation, surrounded by men who clearly didn't care about him. He didn't know where he was going or what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer his own. The SUV sped down winding roads, the city skyline fading behind them as they moved further into the unknown. The lights from the mansion and the sound of the commotion outside had long disappeared. The vehicle's engine roared through the night, cutting through the silence like a knife. After what felt like hours, the SUV pulled into a large, isolated compound. The area was surrounded by tall gates and thick, high walls. Kwame had no idea where they were, but the place looked like a fortress. It was clear that whoever lived here was someone important, someone with power. The SUV came to a screeching halt, and the doors flew open. The men inside rushed out, and one of them grabbed Kwame by the arm once again, pulling him roughly toward a door that led into a darkened building. Inside, the place was just as cold and intimidating as the outside. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The atmosphere was tense, and the silence was deafening. They pushed Kwame into a room that looked more like an interrogation chamber than anything else. A single metal chair sat in the center of the room, with harsh white lights shining down on it. There were no windows, and the door slammed shut behind him with a loud thud. Kwame stood there, frozen in fear. He had no idea what was happening, but something told him that this was far worse than anything he had imagined. A voice came from behind him, deep and commanding. "Sit." Kwame turned slowly to see a man standing in the corner of the room, watching him. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and had an air of authority that made Kwame's knees feel weak. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Kwame with an intensity that made him feel like prey. "Who are you?" Kwame asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stepped forward, his shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, Kwame. You're not just a boy anymore. You're part of something much bigger than yourself, and now you have a choice to make." Kwame felt a cold sweat form on his brow. The man's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and he didn't know how to respond. He just wanted to escape. He wanted to go back to his old life, the life he knew. But somehow, he knew it wasn't that simple. "Why am I here?" Kwame demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just helped Mr. Montgomery because he was hurt. I didn't know this was going to happen." The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down Kwame's spine. "You didn't know, but you're here now, and you're a part of this, whether you like it or not." He leaned in close to Kwame, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Montgomery is valuable. His business, his investments, they're crucial to a lot of people. And now, you're tied to him. You helped him survive, and that means you're part of this war." Kwame's eyes widened. A war? What was this man talking about? Before he could ask another question, the door opened suddenly, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Mr. Montgomery, looking every bit the powerful man he was known to be. But this time, something was different about him. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "You should listen to him, Kwame," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been pulled into a world where power, loyalty, and betrayal are all intertwined. You saved my life, and now you have to decide where you stand." Kwame's heart raced as he looked between the two men. He had never wanted to be involved in anything like this. He didn't belong in this world, and yet here he was, caught up in something he didn't understand. "You have to choose," the man in the suit said, his voice unyielding. "You're either with us or you're against us, and there's no middle ground." Kwame felt a wave of dread wash over him. This wasn't just about saving someone anymore. This was about survival. He had to make a choice, but how could he make such an important decision when he didn't even understand what was at stake? The tension in the room was unbearable, and Kwame's mind spun with questions. What would he choose? What did it mean to be with them? And what would happen if he chose to walk away? Before he could decide, the lights in the room flickered once more, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hall. Something was happening outside, something big, and it was coming for them all. The air in the room grew even heavier as the distant footsteps grew louder, echoing down the hall. Kwame's heart hammered in his chest as his eyes darted nervously between Mr. Montgomery and the cold man in the suit. He couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Everything had escalated so quickly, and now, it seemed like the stakes were higher than ever. "What's going on?" Kwame asked, his voice shaky as the tension in the room mounted. Mr. Montgomery, who had been standing silently, finally stepped forward. "It's happening, Kwame. The people who were after me, they've arrived. They've been tracking me for months, and now they're here. You're caught in the middle of it." Kwame's throat went dry. The fear that had been building in his chest was now threatening to swallow him whole. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. He didn't even know where he was. The man in the suit straightened up and looked toward the door. "Prepare yourself. We're going to need to move quickly. We don't have much time." Kwame's mind was racing. He didn't understand any of this. He had gone from trying to help a man in need to being caught in the middle of some kind of dangerous game between powerful people. His hands trembled, and his head swirled with confusion. "Move where?" Kwame finally asked, his voice small, his stomach a knot of anxiety. Mr. Montgomery turned to him, his face hard. "We have a safe house. It's one of the few places left where we can hide, but it's going to be dangerous. If we don't move now, we risk being caught." Kwame swallowed, trying to process everything. A safe house? It all felt like a bad dream. Just hours ago, he was wandering the streets with nothing but the hope of finding something to eat. Now he was stuck in the middle of a high-stakes situation with men in suits, dangerous enemies, and a millionaire who seemed to be at the center of it all. The sound of boots stomping down the hallway grew louder. There was no more time for questions. The man in the suit looked directly at Kwame. "Get ready," he said sharply, before motioning for him to follow. "We're going now." Kwame didn't have a choice. He followed as they led him out of the interrogation room and down a long corridor. The mansion was eerily quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The men moved quickly, with a sense of urgency that made Kwame's pulse race even faster. They reached a set of large, heavy doors that led into an underground garage. There, A fleet of black SUVs was parked, engines running. The garage was dimly lit, but the vehicles were sleek, powerful machines, ready to move at a moment's notice. Kwame could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but the men didn't hesitate. They moved with precision, their faces serious, their hands ready for whatever might come next. As they approached one of the SUVs, Mr. Montgomery spoke again, his voice low. "We're not just running from enemies. We're running from a war that's been brewing for a long time. You've stepped into something far bigger than yourself. But it's too late to back out now." Kwame's mind swirled with confusion. War? What kind of war? Who were these people, and why was he involved? He wanted to ask 100 more questions, but there was no time. The SUV door was opened for him, and the men around him shoved him inside. The vehicle sped off, leaving the mansion behind as the night swallowed them whole. The sound of tires screeching on the pavement filled the silence, but there was no comfort in it. Kwame could feel the danger closing in. The suited man in the front seat glanced back at him. "You don't have to be a part of this, Kwame. But if you want to survive, you need to listen closely. We're heading to a safe house now. It's the only place we can regroup and plan our next move. Once we get there, things will change. There's no going back." Kwame's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything was happening too fast, and he was caught in the middle of it. He had gone from helping a man who needed him to being thrust into a world of danger and uncertainty. The simple life he once knew was slipping through his fingers, and there was no way to get it back. The SUV's tires hummed as they sped down an empty road, and Kwame couldn't help but glance out of the window. The city was far behind them now, the lights fading into the distance. They were headed towards something unknown, something that felt darker with every passing second. Minutes later, the SUV turned off the main road, veering onto a narrow dirt path. The trees on either side were thick and untamed, and the only light came from the headlights of the car, cutting through the darkness. The place felt remote, isolated, and that only made Kwame more nervous. The SUV slowed down and eventually stopped in front of an old, nondescript building. It was surrounded by trees, hidden away from the world. No lights were visible inside, and the structure itself seemed abandoned. But Kwame had no time to question it. The men immediately began unloading from the vehicles, taking up defensive positions as they moved toward the building. Mr. Montgomery stepped out of the SUV first, his face grim. He turned to Kwame, who was still in the back seat, staring wide-eyed at the surroundings. "This is it," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice low. "We'll be safe here for a while, but don't relax. The people after me will be relentless. They'll come for us. And if they find us—" Kwame didn't need to hear the rest. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. Everything was happening too quickly, and he had no way of preparing for what was coming. They moved inside the building, and the heavy door was shut behind them with a loud bang. Inside, it was stark and cold, with only the faint glow of dim light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The place looked like a bunker, secure, but uncomfortable. Kwame was led down a narrow hallway and into a small room where several men were already gathered around a table, discussing something in hushed tones. As Kwame stepped inside, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him. Mr. Montgomery turned to the men and nodded. "This is the boy who saved my life. Kwame, this is the team that's been working to protect me. And now, you're part of it. You'll need to learn quickly." Kwame stood there, feeling the weight of the room pressing in on him. These were the people he would have to rely on now. But for what? To survive a war he didn't even understand? He had no choice but to follow their lead. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Kwame's heart skipped a beat. The door opened just a crack, and a man's voice called from outside. "They're here. We need to move. Now." Everything inside Kwame told him to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The war was here, and it was about to get worse. The tension in the room was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity as the men gathered around the table, their faces tight with anxiety. Kwame stood frozen in the corner, his mind racing. The knock on the door, the warning from the man outside. It was all too much. He couldn't understand how everything had changed so fast. One moment, he was a kid with nothing, and now, He was a part of something that felt as dangerous as it was confusing. Mr. Montgomery turned sharply, his face darkening with concern. "Get ready," he said, his voice commanding. "They're here." The men in the room immediately sprang into action, moving with practiced precision. They grabbed weapons from a nearby cabinet, checked the ammunition, and pulled on gear as if they had done this 100 times before. The urgency in the air made Kwame's heart race. He had never been around people like this, people who were ready to fight at a moment's notice. "What's going to happen?" Kwame asked, his voice trembling slightly. He couldn't stop himself. He had to know what he was walking into. Mr. Montgomery didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. His grip was firm, but his eyes softened. "You've already made a choice, Kwame. You're in this now, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe, but you need to trust me." Kwame nodded, though he wasn't sure if he could trust anyone at this point. But the man's words held a strange sense of authority that made him feel like he didn't have much of a choice. "Stay close," Mr. Montgomery added, his voice low and urgent. "Do exactly what we say, and don't hesitate. These men, they're here to kill me. And if you want to survive this, you need to follow our lead." The door slammed open, and a man rushed in, his face grim. "They've breached the perimeter. They're coming in fast." Kwame felt his heart drop. They were already under attack. The very thing Mr. Montgomery had been preparing for was happening right before his eyes. His world had gone from confusion to chaos in a matter of hours. He had no time to process it. The fight was already here. "Move out," Mr. Montgomery shouted, his voice cold and determined. "Now." The room exploded into motion. The men grabbed their gear and positioned themselves by the windows and doors. Kwame was pulled along with them, his small feet scrambling to keep up. His mind was spinning. One moment, he had been sitting in a mansion, eating a meal he'd never imagined, and the next, he was running for his life in the dark, unsure of what would happen next. "Where are we going?" Kwame asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're getting to a safe place," Mr. Montgomery said, his expression hardening. "But you need to trust us, Kwame. This is real. These people don't care about anyone. Not you, not me. They'll stop at nothing to finish what they started." Kwame swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His eyes darted from one man to another. They moved with such intensity, as if they had done this 1,000 times. But Kwame felt lost. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for any of this. "Stay behind me," Mr. Montgomery ordered as he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. "And stay quiet." The group moved quickly through the building, their steps light and precise. Every door, every corner was checked for threats. The atmosphere was thick with urgency. Kwame's heart raced as they moved through darkened corridors, his breath quick and shallow. He felt a strange mix of fear and adrenaline, as if his entire body was on alert. They reached a back door that led outside to a small courtyard, surrounded by tall trees and thick foliage. The men spread out, their eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. Kwame was just about to ask where they were going next when he heard the sound of an engine, a loud, rumbling sound that sent a chill through his spine. "They're here," Mr. Montgomery muttered. "Get to the car. Now." The group quickly moved toward a set of black SUVs parked at the far end of the courtyard. Kwame's mind was racing. What kind of people were these? Why did they want Mr. Montgomery dead? What did he get himself into? As they reached the SUVs, a group of armed men emerged from the trees, their faces masked, their weapons raised. The men in suits around Kwame immediately took cover, returning fire with deadly accuracy. The sound of gunshots rang out, sharp and jarring, as the two sides clashed. Kwame crouched behind one of the SUVs, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him seemed to slow down as his brain tried to process what was happening. He had never seen anything like this, never imagined his life could spiral into this kind of danger. "Stay down," one of the men shouted, pushing Kwame further behind the SUV. "Don't move until I say so." Kwame nodded, barely able to breathe, his body shaking with fear. He tried to focus on staying low, trying to block out the sounds of the gunfight around him. The crack of bullets hitting the ground, the shouts of the men in combat, Everything was so overwhelming. Minutes felt like hours as the gunfire continued. Kwame's hands trembled as he clutched the side of the SUV, trying to keep himself hidden. He could hear the men shouting orders to each other, but it all felt like a blur. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the gunfire stopped. Kwame's heart skipped a beat. What had happened? He slowly peeked around the side of the vehicle, his eyes searching the darkened courtyard. The men who had attacked them were gone, but the tension still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Is it over? Kwame asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The suited man who had been leading them gave him a hard look. No, it's just begun. Mr. Montgomery emerged from behind one of the trees, his face set in a grim expression. He was breathing heavily, but he looked determined. The rest of the team moved out from their cover, checking the area to ensure no further threats were lurking. We're not safe yet, Mr. Montgomery said, his voice low. That was just the first wave. They'll be back, and next time they'll be ready. Kwame swallowed, his throat tight. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. He had no idea what was going on, but one thing was clear. His life was no longer his own. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Mr. Montgomery turned to him, his eyes sharp. Stay close, Kwame. If you want to survive, you need to listen and follow our every move. This isn't a game. This is real. And we're not finished yet. As they piled back into the SUVs and sped off into the night, Kwame couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than he could comprehend was happening. The danger was real, the stakes were high, and there was no turning back. Kwame sat in the back of the SUV, gripping the seat as the vehicle sped down the winding road. The engine roared as it cut through the dark, isolated path, leaving the chaos of the safe house behind them. His mind was still reeling from the gunfight, the sudden attack, and the overwhelming realization that he was now part of something much larger than he could understand. The SUV bumped along the uneven road, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Kwame couldn't shake the images of the masked men, their guns raised, the way everything had descended into violence so quickly. He had been terrified. He'd never been so close to death before. And yet, here he was, still alive, still unsure of what exactly was happening. He glanced at Mr. Montgomery, who was seated across from him in the back of the SUV. The millionaire's face was set in stone. His jaw clenched as he stared out the window, lost in thought. The other men in the vehicle were equally silent, their expressions serious, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The suited man who had been leading them through the safe house and the subsequent gunfight turned to look at Kwame. I hope you're ready for what's coming. This isn't over. They know where we are now, and we're going to have to stay on the move until we figure out how to stop them. Kwame swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Who are they? Why are they after Mr. Montgomery? The man didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered to Mr. Montgomery before turning back to Kwame. You'll find out soon enough. But for now, the less you know, the better. There are people in this world who'll do anything to get what they want. Mr. Montgomery has something they need, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Kwame tried to absorb the man's words, but it was all too much. He couldn't understand what Mr. Montgomery could possibly have that was so important, so valuable, that people were willing to kill for it. It didn't make sense. Just keep your head down, Kwame, the man continued. Trust us and stay close. If you want to survive, you'll need to listen and learn quickly. The road stretched on, but Kwame didn't have the energy to ask more questions. His mind was too busy trying to process everything that had happened so far. The gunfight, the dangerous men chasing them, the constant fear in the air. It was all too much for a boy his age. The SUV took another turn, and suddenly, the scenery around them shifted. The road began to straighten out, and the dense trees that had surrounded them for miles began to open up. The faint glow of lights ahead broke the darkness, signaling a change in direction. We're almost there, the suited man said, his voice calm but tense. Kwame didn't know where they were going. All he knew was that he didn't feel safe. Not in the mansion, not in the safe house, and not in this SUV. The people around him were powerful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they, too, were in danger. He wasn't sure if he could trust any of them, not even Mr. Montgomery, who had saved his life just hours earlier. The SUV finally came to a stop in front of a large, nondescript building. Another hidden structure, this time in the middle of a remote area. There were no signs, no indication of what this place was, just an imposing steel gate and a high stone wall surrounding it. The moment the vehicle stopped, the men inside immediately began to move with purpose. "Stay close," Mr. Montgomery said again, his voice low but firm. "Don't wander off. If anything happens, you follow me. Understand?" Kwame nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he could feel the tension in the air. Something big was coming, something dangerous. The people who were after Mr. Montgomery weren't just any criminals. They were powerful, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. They moved quickly through the entrance, passing a security checkpoint before entering the building. The interior was sleek, modern, and surprisingly calm. But Kwame knew better than to be fooled by appearances. This place might look safe, but it was only a matter of time before the storm arrived. They were led down a long hallway and into a large, dimly lit room. Inside, several people were already gathered. More men in suits, more people who seemed to belong to this strange, dangerous world. Mr. Montgomery took a seat at the head of the table, and the rest of the group followed suit. Kwame was motioned to sit beside him, his body tense and unsure of what was going to happen next. "We've got a problem," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "The enemy knows where we are, and they'll be here soon. We have to move fast." Kwame couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. How could they be so sure? What kind of people were these? And how could they be prepared for something that was happening so quickly? Mr. Montgomery's eyes scanned the room, his gaze landing on each of the men seated around the table. "The time has come for us to make our move. We've been preparing for this day, and now it's here. We need to go on the offensive. It's not just about protecting ourselves anymore. It's about taking the fight to them." Kwame's heart raced. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somehow, he was right in the middle of it. One of the men at the table spoke up, his voice low and tense. "What's the plan, sir?" Mr. Montgomery leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "We'll start by cutting off their supply lines. We know they're relying on a network of people, some of whom are on the inside. We need to root them out. Get the intel we need to strike at the heart of their operation." Kwame didn't fully understand what Mr. Montgomery was saying, but he could sense the seriousness of the situation. These men weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting a war, and that war was only going to get more dangerous from here. "This is it," Mr. Montgomery continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "The stakes are higher than ever, but we're ready. We have everything we need to win. All we need now is for everyone to stay sharp. No mistakes." Kwame was still reeling from the events of the past few hours. He had no idea what the plan was or how he fit into it, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just a matter of survival. This was about something much bigger, something that Kwame couldn't even begin to comprehend. As the men began to discuss the details of their next move, Kwame sat quietly, trying to absorb it all. He was no longer just a kid from the streets. He had been thrust into a world of secrets, danger, and power. And he had no idea how it was going to end. But as the discussions grew more intense, Kwame felt something inside him stir, a spark of determination. He had helped save Mr. Montgomery's life. Maybe, just maybe, he could help turn the tide in this war. He wasn't sure how, but for the first time since all of this began, he knew that he had a role to play, and he was ready to step up. Kwame sat in the dimly lit room, his fingers tapping nervously on the table in front of him. The conversation around him was a blur, the men speaking in hushed tones, their words filled with terms Kwame didn't fully understand. They were talking about networks, supply lines, and insider information. It all seemed too complicated, too far beyond what a boy like him should be involved in. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was now a part of something huge, something far bigger than he ever could have imagined. Mr. Montgomery's calm, authoritative voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "We need to strike at their base of operations. If we can cut off their resources, we can cripple them before they have a chance to recover. We'll make it clear that they can't touch us without facing consequences. Kwame didn't fully understand what he meant by them or what their base of operations was, but one thing was certain. Mr. Montgomery wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was preparing for a full-on war. And Kwame was right in the middle of it. "How do we get the information we need?" one of the men asked, his voice laced with concern. "We don't have the manpower for a full assault yet. We'll need intel to make the first move." Mr. Montgomery turned his gaze to the man who had spoken, his expression hard. "We don't need manpower. We need someone who can slip past their defenses, someone who can get close without being noticed. We need someone they won't suspect." The room went silent as all eyes turned toward Kwame. His stomach sank. He had been listening, but he hadn't expected this. He had been hoping to stay out of the spotlight, to remain just a kid caught up in a mess he didn't understand. But now it seemed that the mess was surrounding him more and more. The weight of their gazes was overwhelming. Mr. Montgomery spoke again, his voice filled with conviction. "Kwame has already shown that he can act without hesitation. He's the perfect candidate. He's already been in their world. He knows how to blend in, how to survive when others would crumble. We'll use that to our advantage." Kwame's mind raced. He had no idea what they were asking him to do, but the way Mr. Montgomery spoke, like this was the only option, the only way to win, made him feel like there was no choice. If he said no, what would happen? Would they just leave him behind? Would he be in even more danger? "Are you sure about this?" one of the men asked, clearly skeptical. "He's just a kid. This isn't a game. We're talking about taking down an entire organization." Mr. Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for second-guessing. Kwame is the one who can get us in without being seen. He's already earned their trust, in a way. They won't expect him to be a threat. And that's why he's our best shot." Kwame couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had just been a homeless boy a few days ago, trying to survive the streets. Now, he was being thrust into a dangerous mission with people who thought he could take down a criminal organization. He wanted to refuse, to run away, but the look in Mr. Montgomery's eyes, the determination, the confidence, made him feel like this was his only choice. "We'll train him," Mr. Montgomery continued, his voice unwavering. "He'll have the skills he needs to succeed, and we'll be with him every step of the way." Kwame's mind was spinning, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had been changed forever. There was no going back now. The conversation shifted to logistics. Plans were being drawn up, routes mapped out, and contingencies prepared. But Kwame was no longer listening. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the weight of what lay ahead. He couldn't believe he was about to do this, but deep down, he knew that it was his only option if he wanted to survive. Hours passed as they continued to prepare, making phone calls, gathering supplies, and finalizing the plan. Kwame sat quietly, processing everything in his mind. The world he had known, the streets, the hunger, the loneliness, seemed so far away now. In its place was a world of danger and high stakes. He was no longer just a boy. He was part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. When the meeting finally broke up, Kwame was pulled aside by Mr. Montgomery. The others left the room, leaving the two of them alone. "You understand what you have to do, don't you?" Mr. Montgomery asked, his voice steady but serious. Kwame nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully did. "I think so. I'm scared. What if I can't do it? What if something goes wrong?" Mr. Montgomery's expression softened for a moment. "Fear is normal. It's what keeps us sharp, keeps us from making mistakes. But you've already proven that you can act when it matters. You've got this." Kwame didn't feel so sure, but something about Mr. Montgomery's words made him feel a little more confident. The million-dollar question was, would he be able to go through with it? "We'll give you everything you need to succeed," Mr. Montgomery continued, "and we'll have your back. But I need you to promise me one thing, Kwame." Kwame looked up at him, waiting for the next words. "Don't hesitate. If you hesitate, it could cost you your life. And it could cost all of us our shot at taking them down. Do you understand?" Kwame's throat tightened. He wasn't sure if he could promise that. He wasn't sure if he was ready to put everything on the line. But he nodded, slowly. "I understand." Mr. Montgomery placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a firm but reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, Kwame. And you've got more courage than most people twice your age." Kwame wasn't so sure about that, but he didn't say anything. All he could do was keep moving forward, step by step, into a world that had already proven to be more dangerous than anything he had ever known. As the night wore on, Kwame found himself in a small training room where the others had gathered to prepare him. The suited men who had been working with Mr. Montgomery were there, running him through various scenarios, teaching him how to move quietly, how to use the equipment, how to read the situation. It was exhausting, physically and mentally. Every time Kwame thought he had learned something, they pushed him harder, demanding more focus, more precision. He was sore, tired, and overwhelmed, but there was no time for rest. They couldn't afford to waste a single moment. And then, at the end of the night, just as he was about to collapse, the suited man who had been guiding him pulled him aside. "You're doing well," he said, his voice gruff. "But you're still not ready. We're going to have to move quickly. Tomorrow, we take action." Kwame's stomach churned. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. There was no going back. The dawn broke with a heavy silence. The air was still, yet it seemed to hum with tension. Kwame woke in the small, dimly lit room where he had finally been allowed to rest for a few hours. The events of the previous day were fresh in his mind. The training, the hurried preparations, and the chilling realization that today was the day everything would change. As he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, a soft knock sounded at the door. It creaked open to reveal Mr. Montgomery, dressed in dark tactical gear that made him look more like a soldier than the millionaire Kwame had met only days before. "It's time," Mr. Montgomery said simply. His tone left no room for hesitation. Kwame nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling slightly as he followed Mr. Montgomery out of the room and down a narrow hallway. The rest of the team was already gathered in a large briefing area, their faces serious as they went over the final details of the plan. On a large table in the center of the room was a detailed map of the enemy compound. Kwame stared at it, trying to make sense of the lines and markings that crisscrossed the paper. He couldn't believe he was about to be part of something so dangerous, so far removed from the life he had known. The suited man who had taken the lead during the previous chaos gestured for Kwame to step closer. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice firm but steady. "Your role is critical. You'll infiltrate the compound here." He pointed to a small section of the map, marked with an X. "There's a weak spot in their defenses. They won't be expecting someone like you. That's your advantage." Kwame's stomach churned. He couldn't believe they were counting on him to be the key to their entire plan. "What do I do once I'm inside?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll locate their communications hub," the man explained. "It's where they store all their intel. If we can access it, we'll have the information we need to dismantle their entire operation. You'll plant this device." He handed Kwame a small, unassuming gadget. "It'll upload their files directly to us. Once it's done, you get out as fast as you can." Kwame stared at the device in his hand, his fingers trembling. It felt heavier than it should, as if the weight of the mission itself was concentrated in that small object. He didn't know if he could do this, but there was no turning back now. The suited man continued, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "You'll have support. We'll be monitoring you from here, and if anything goes wrong, we'll extract you. But make no mistake, this is dangerous. If they catch you," he trailed off, letting the unspoken words hang in the air. Kwame nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't need the man to finish. He knew what would happen if he failed. The ride to the enemy compound was tense. Kwame sat in the back of the SUV, clutching the small device in his hand as the vehicle sped through the empty roads. The others were silent, their faces grim as they prepared for the mission ahead. Kwame couldn't help but feel out of place among them. These were trained professionals, people who had probably faced danger 100 times before. And here he was, a homeless boy with no experience, being thrust into the center of a high-stakes operation. As they approached the compound, the driver slowed the vehicle and pulled off the road, stopping a safe distance away. "This is as far as we go," he said quietly. "The rest is up to you." Kwame took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at his skin, and the darkness around him felt suffocating. He could see the compound in the distance, a massive structure surrounded by high fences and armed guards. It looked impenetrable, but the team had assured him there was a way in. "Remember," Mr. Montgomery said, placing a hand on Kwame's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. Trust your instincts." Kwame nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. With one last glance at the group, he turned and began making his way toward the compound, his heart pounding with every step. The path to the weak spot in the fence was exactly as they had described, a narrow gap hidden by overgrown bushes. Kwame crouched low as he approached, his eyes darting nervously as he scanned for guards. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. He reached the fence and slipped through the gap, his small frame making it easy to navigate the tight space. Once inside, he pressed himself against the shadows, moving carefully and deliberately as he made his way toward the building. The compound was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the faint hum of electricity and the occasional crunch of gravel under Kwame's feet. Every step felt like a risk, every shadow a potential threat. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest as he crept closer to the communications hub. Finally, he reached the building. The door was unlocked, just as the team had predicted. He slipped inside, his movements careful and deliberate. The room was filled with rows of computers and blinking lights, the glow of the monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. Kwame's hands trembled as he pulled out the device. He found the main console and plugged it in, just as he had been instructed. The screen lit up with lines of code, and a progress bar appeared, slowly inching its way forward. "Come on," Kwame whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every second felt like an eternity as the progress bar crawled forward. And then, just as the bar reached 100%, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Kwame's heart stopped. He froze, his mind racing as the footsteps grew louder, closer. He didn't know what to do. There was no time to think, no time to plan. The mission was complete, but now he had to escape, and fast. The door handle began to turn. Kwame's pulse pounded in his ears as he scrambled for a place to hide. He dove behind a stack of crates just as the door swung open. Two armed guards entered the room, their eyes scanning the space. "I thought I heard something," one of them said, his voice low and suspicious. "You're imagining things," the other replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Kwame held his breath, his body pressed tightly against the crates. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, threatening to give him away. The guards moved closer, their footsteps echoing ominously in the small room. Kwame's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He had to get out of there, but how? One of the guards stopped just inches from his hiding spot. Kwame's grip tightened on the edge of the crate. And then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the computers silenced as the lights went out completely. Kwame's breath hitched as he pressed himself further against the crates, the sudden blackout both a blessing and a curse. He couldn't see the guards, but he knew they couldn't see him either. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of their nervous shuffling and whispered curses. "What the hell just happened?" one of the guards muttered, his voice tense. "Check the systems," the other barked. "We can't afford to lose power." Kwame's mind raced. He knew the blackout had to be part of the team's plan, a distraction to cover his escape. But he couldn't stay hidden much longer. His only chance was to move while the guards were disoriented. Summoning every ounce of courage, Kwame began to crawl along the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. The darkness was thick, and the faint glow of emergency lights from the hallway provided just enough illumination to guide him. He could hear the guards moving in the opposite direction, their focus on the consoles and computers. "Nothing's working," one of them growled. "It's like the whole system's been wiped." Good, Kwame thought. That meant the device had done its job. Now he just had to get out alive. He reached the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty. Taking a deep breath, he slipped out of the room, his footsteps light against the cold floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he retraced his path through the compound, his memory guiding him back to the gap in the fence. The corridors seemed endless, every shadow a potential threat. He could hear distant voices, guards shouting orders, their heavy boots echoing in the distance. The compound was on high alert, and he knew time was running out. Finally, Kwame reached the fence. He dropped to his knees and crawled through the narrow gap, the cold metal scraping against his skin. On the other side, the thick bushes provided a welcome cover. He stayed low, his breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Kwame, do you copy?" Mr. Montgomery's voice crackled in his ear, the comm device hidden in his pocket suddenly coming to life. "Yes," Kwame whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm outside. I made it out." "Good," Mr. Montgomery said. "Head to the extraction point. We're waiting for you." Kwame didn't need to be told twice. He moved quickly but carefully, sticking to the shadows as he made his way toward the extraction point. The faint sound of engines in the distance guided him, and soon he saw the black SUVs parked in a secluded clearing. The moment he emerged from the trees, the suited man who had been his guide waved him over. "Get in," he barked. Kwame sprinted the last few steps and dove into the back of the SUV. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the vehicle roared to life, speeding away from the compound. The tension in the car was palpable as the team waited for confirmation that they were in the clear. Kwame sat silently, his hands trembling as he clutched his knees. He couldn't believe he had made it out. Every second in that compound had felt like an eternity, but now, for the first time, he felt a glimmer of relief. Finally, Mr. Montgomery broke the silence. The device worked. "We've got their intel." The men in the car exchanged nods, their expressions hard but satisfied. Kwame glanced at Mr. Montgomery, who turned to him with a small, rare smile. "You did well, Kwame," he said. "Better than I could have hoped for." Kwame didn't know how to respond. He felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. He had just pulled off something he never would have thought possible. But even as the praise sank in, he couldn't shake the lingering fear. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. The SUV drove for hours, taking winding roads through dense forests until they finally reached another safe house. This one was smaller, more hidden, but it offered the security they desperately needed. Once inside, the team immediately got to work analyzing the data Kwame had retrieved. Kwame sat in a corner, watching as the men pored over the information. He felt out of place, unsure of what his role was now that the mission was over. But then Mr. Montgomery approached him, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Kwame," he said, his voice sincere. "You've proven that you're capable of handling yourself in ways most people can't. And because of you, we have a chance to end this." Kwame looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly. "I don't know if I'm ready for more of this," he admitted. "I'm just a kid." Mr. Montgomery nodded. "You are. And you've already done more than anyone your age should ever have to. But the truth is, you've also shown strength that most adults don't have. You saved my life, Kwame. And today, you helped save countless others." Kwame felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say. The weight of everything he had been through was finally sinking in. But he also felt a sense of purpose, a feeling he had never known before. "What happens now?" he asked. Mr. Montgomery's expression hardened. "Now, we take this fight to them. And when it's over, you'll have the life you deserve. A real life. A future." Kwame nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the same boy who had wandered the streets just days ago. He had found strength he didn't know he had, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As the team continued their preparations, the faint hum of an engine outside signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Kwame stood by the window, watching as a new convoy of vehicles pulled into the compound. Among them was a sleek, black Maybach, its polished exterior gleaming in the moonlight. It had only been days since his life had changed forever. And now, as he stood in the shadow of the world he had been thrust into, Kwame knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with danger, but also with hope. The boy who had once been homeless was now something more. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to walk it.